I was standing on the aluminum ladder outside my front door, both hands working the old black lantern back into its mount, when the question came out of me, half a joke, half something I hadn't named yet. Nora was below on the porch, holding the red and black toolbox against her chest, eyes tilted up to mine. "Why are you always so nice to me?" I said. She didn't answer right away. Then I watched it happen, color rising in her cheeks, slow and real, like something that couldn't be held back anymore. She was looking straight at me, and then she said 3 words I had no preparation for. "Because I love you." I didn't move. I stood on that ladder with the lantern in my hands and felt the whole ordinary Saturday afternoon rearrange itself around me. Not dramatically, just permanently. My name is Daniel Reeves, 38 years old, licensed electrician, Class A, state of Ohio, and owner of a small repair and installation business on the east side of Columbus called Reeves Electric. It's not an empire. I want to be clear about that. It's me, 2 part-time guys named Carlos and Pete, a rented space in a commercial strip off Livingston Avenue where I keep inventory and do paperwork, and a white work truck with a hand-drawn logo I sketched on a legal pad one evening and then, for reasons I still can't fully explain, took directly to a sign shop. The lettering came out slightly uneven on the left side. I kept it anyway. People remember it. Pete says it has character. I say, it looks like I drew it on a legal pad, which is technically accurate. I've been on Maple Street for going on 4 years. It's a real neighborhood, not a development, not a cul-de-sac of identical houses that all went up in the same 18 months. The houses here were built across several decades, which means they don't match, which means each one has its own particular personality. Mine is 3 bedrooms, dark green shutters, a covered porch that wraps around the left side of the house. I love that porch. I love it. The way you love something that you've spent real time on the northwest corner was sagging when I bought it, and I spent a weekend in the fall of my first year here rebuilding the support structure from scratch. My brother Mark drove up from Dayton to help, and we argued for 2 hours about the right way to sister the joists, and then we did it my way, and it held, and the porch is level now, and I think about that with quiet satisfaction every time I walk across it. I wake up most mornings at 5:50 without an alarm. It's just where my body lands after years of early job sites. By 6, the coffee is going and the radio in the kitchen is on low country station out of Gahanna, the kind of small market operation where the morning DJ still reads the weather reports himself and says things like, "We've got some weather coming through," in a tone that suggests he finds this personally interesting. I stand at the kitchen counter and eat whatever I've got and drink the coffee and listen to the forecast. And most mornings that is enough. The house smells like pine floor cleaner on weekends, and the trace of motor oil that lives in the garage never quite leaves the rest of the house, no matter how well I seal the door. I've stopped trying to get rid of it. It smells like work, and work is what I know. Stacy and I were married for 6 years and divorced for 2. No children together. When it ended, she moved to an apartment over in Clintonville, nice place, close to the short north, which suited her better than this side of town ever had. I stayed here, in this house that I had rewired outlet by outlet, repainted room by room, fixed and adjusted and made function the way I understand how to make things function. I don't say that with bitterness. I've thought about whether there's bitterness in it, and I genuinely don't find much. What I find, mostly, is a kind of clarifying honesty. I understood this house better than I understood the marriage, and I think Stacy knew that too. And I think it was part of why she was the one who left. Some things come apart cleanly when they've run their course. This one did. After she left, the house got quiet. Not in a bad way necessarily, more like a held breath kind of quiet, like a room after the music stops and before anyone decides whether to put something else on. I filled the quiet with what I knew. Early mornings, job sites, the routine of a man who trusts his hands. I wasn't unhappy. I want to say that plainly because unhappy is the word people reach for when a man lives alone, and it's not always the right word. I was functional, and steady, and mostly fine, and there was just a hum, underneath everything, a frequency I'd stopped consciously registering. The lantern above my front door is black iron, mounted to the left of the frame. It was there when I moved in. Some previous owner had it installed, and they had decent taste, and I inherited the benefit of that. The bulb burned out sometime in late autumn of my 3rd year on Maple Street. I noticed it the way you notice a dripping faucet, registered it, made a mental note, got distracted, made another mental note, got distracted again. Months went by. The porch stayed dark. I came home to it in the evenings, and I didn't particularly think about the darkness anymore. I think I'd just gotten used to it, the way I'd gotten used to a lot of things being dimmer than they could have been. You stop noticing the absence. That's what the absence does to you. Nora Castillo lives directly across the street. 35 years old. She teaches 8th grade English at Roosevelt Middle School, 2 miles from here on Thurston Avenue. She's been on Maple Street nearly as long as I have. She moved in about 8 months before I did. I found out later, which means she was there when I pulled the moving truck up for the first time. I didn't know that then. When I moved in, she was simply a neighbor. Face, approximate age, friendly, brown hair usually pulled back, good at waving. She waved when I came out to get the mail. I waved back. That was our relationship, or so I understood it at the time. The first time Nora came across the street with a clear purpose, it was a Saturday in late March, cold enough to still feel like winter in the morning but warming up by early afternoon. I was in the garage sorting through a box of miscellaneous hardware I'd been meaning to organize since the previous October. I heard footsteps on the porch and came around the side of the house to find her standing at the base of the porch steps with the red and black toolbox in both hands. "Hey," I said. "Hey." She tilted her chin toward the lantern above the door. "Did you notice that burned out?" "I did. I've been meaning to." "I brought a replacement." She set the toolbox down and opened the lid. Inside, fitted in the foam cutout, was a single light bulb still in its original packaging. She held it up. "It's the right type for that fixture. Should be a direct swap." I stood there looking at the bulb, then at her, then at the bulb again. "How did you know what type it takes?" She tilted her head slightly. "Lucky guess." She said it with the same quiet, settled expression she seemed to carry everywhere, not coy, not evasive, just calm in a way I didn't quite know how to parse. She handed me the bulb, picked up her toolbox, and crossed back to her house before I'd finished processing what had just happened. I stood on the porch for a long moment, holding a light bulb that was, in fact, exactly the right type. I turned it over in my hands. I thought about how a person makes a lucky guess like that from across the street for a fixture she'd never been close to. I thought maybe she'd looked it up somehow, found the make of the fixture online and checked the specs. It seemed like a lot of effort for a light bulb. I filed it under neighborly and went back to the garage. 3 weeks later I got sick. Whatever was going around that spring, I caught the full version, the kind of head cold that evolves into something lower and more serious, that parks itself in your chest and stays for a week. I canceled jobs, apologized to Carlos and Pete, and sat up on the couch with the television on and the sound low enough that I could sleep through it when the medication hit. I wasn't miserable, just empty, the way you go empty when your body is using everything it has to fight something off. On the 3rd evening, someone knocked at the front door. I got up slowly and opened it. Nora was on the porch, holding a covered glass container with steam still curling at the edges. She held it out. "Chicken soup," she said. "Homemade." I blinked at her. My voice sounded like a man who'd been sleeping for 2 days. "You made soup." I had a pot going anyway. It wasn't a production. I took the container. The warmth of it went straight through my palms. "How did you know I was sick?" "Your truck hasn't moved since Monday." I looked at her. She was looking at me with that steady, even expression, not searching for a reaction, not waiting for praise, just there, delivering soup, completely at ease with what she'd done. "You're tracking my truck," I said, and I meant it as a joke. She smiled, small, quick, gone. "Feel better, Daniel." Then she went back across the street, and that was it. I went inside and sat down with the soup, and it was the best thing I'd eaten in 3 days. I thought about it more than made immediate sense. I kept arriving at the same conclusion. A person brings soup to a sick neighbor. Decent people do this. I'd done it myself for an older woman on my block in Cincinnati when I was 24. It didn't mean anything particular. I reminded myself of that and finished the soup and went back to the couch. A few weeks after that, the Hendersons threw a cookout in their driveway. Nothing formal, a grill going, some folding chairs, the kind of gathering that assembles itself out of proximity and decent weather. I went because I like the Hendersons, and because the weather really was good, and because standing in a driveway with paper plates is about the right level of social engagement for a Saturday evening when you're not looking for anything complicated. Nora was there. We ended up near each other by the folding table with the food, and we talked. Really talked. Not just weather and pleasantries. She asked about the business, what kind of jobs I did most, what I liked about the work. I told her I liked the diagnostic side more than the installation side. Finding the fault, tracing the line back to where something had gone wrong. She said that was interesting. I asked about her students. She told me about a kid named Marcus who had, apparently, decided that the correct way to open any written assignment was with a quotation from a rapper she'd never heard of, and who defended this choice with great seriousness when challenged. I laughed, and it was a real laugh, and I noticed that it felt easy. At some point in the conversation, I don't remember what we were talking about exactly when it came up, I mentioned that East of Eden was the first book that had ever made me feel like the world was bigger than I'd understood it to be, that I'd read it when I was 17, and it had done something to how I read everything after. I said it casually, the way you say things about books when you're standing next to a folding table eating chips. I didn't think about it again that evening. 2 weeks later, I found a book on my front porch steps. Hardcover. Old. The words on the spine. East of Eden. John Steinbeck. No note. No name. No indication of how it had gotten there. I picked it up and turned it over. The pages had that specific scent of a used bookstore paper and dust, and the faint sweetness of old glue, and the binding was tight, which meant someone had maintained it well. Someone had found this in a store or a sale or a box, had selected it specifically, had carried it across a street and set it on my steps and walked away. I stood on my porch for a full minute before I went inside. I didn't knock on her door. I didn't make it into a thing that had to be acknowledged. I set the book on my nightstand and started reading it that night, for the first time since I was 17, and it was exactly as good as I'd remembered, maybe better, with different things striking me now than had struck me then. In early May, I noticed that a section of the porch fascia, along the north corner, had gone soft. Water had gotten in over the winter. The wood had started to degrade, and it needed to come out and be replaced before it caused problems further down the line. I pulled out the ladder, got my tools organized, and climbed up to start working on it on a Saturday morning when I had nothing else scheduled. It was a two-person job, in the sense that ladders are always easier with someone at the base, but I'd done plenty of one-person ladder work in my time, and I wasn't worried about it. I was maybe 20 minutes in when I heard footsteps below. I looked down. Nora was at the base of the ladder, both hands gripping the rails, her feet planted. She was looking up at me with that same even, unhurried expression. She hadn't said anything. She'd just walked over and taken hold of the ladder. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. She didn't elaborate. I went back to work. The morning went on. I came down once to get a different bit from my toolbox, and she stepped back without being asked. And when I went back up, she was there again, holding the base. An hour passed, maybe more. I looked down twice more during that time, once just to check. Once because I'd half convinced myself she'd have gone back home, and both times she was there. Hands on the rails, eyes up, not on her phone, not distracted, not fidgeting, just present and steady in a way that required explanation, but that I found I didn't want to interrupt with questions. When I finally came down for the last time and started folding up the ladder, I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Of course," and went back across the street. I put the ladder away and stood in the garage for a while just thinking. A month or so after that, there was a rainy night, middle of June, one of those Ohio summer rains that starts just before dark and settles in for the evening. I couldn't sleep. I ended up in the chair by the bedroom window, just watching the water run down the glass, not reading, not on my phone, just in that particular restless non-state that insomnia sometimes lands you in. Outside, the street was empty and wet, and the streetlight on the corner was making halos in the mist. Nora's house across the way had a window lit her living room, I thought, or possibly the kitchen. A warm yellow rectangle in all that gray. I looked at it for a while, and then I thought, I wonder what she's doing right now. The thought arrived as casually and naturally as any other thought I'd had that day, And for exactly that reason, it caught me off guard. I sat with it for a moment, then I got up from the chair and went to bed and told myself it was late, and I was tired, and insomnia makes things feel significant that aren't. Then came the Saturday in July. The afternoon that I've already described, that I started with, that I keep coming back to. She crossed the street with the toolbox. She stood at the base of the porch with that matter-of-fact certainty. We should change that out today. I climbed the ladder without question, because it felt natural, because she'd established a kind of authority in the situation through sheer quiet competence and consistency, and I was up there with the housing in my hands, and the day was warm, and I'd been turning things over in my mind for months without articulating any of them, and the question just surfaced, unguarded, honest. Why are you always so nice to me? And the world changed its shape. Stacy showed up on a Friday evening in late August. No call ahead, no text. I heard the car door from the kitchen, looked out, and there was her silver sedan in the driveway. I hadn't seen her in about 4 months, which was roughly the right interval for two people who had ended things without hostility and were doing their level best to remain decent to each other from a respectful distance. She looked exactly like herself, put together in the specific, deliberate way she'd always had. Dark hair straight, a silk blouse the color of slate, heels on a porch made of old wood that didn't particularly appreciate heels. She wore the perfume she'd worn for as long as I'd known her. It hit me when she walked in, not with longing, not with grief, just with recognition. The way a smell will drop you back into a time without asking. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table like she still had standing to do so. I sat across from her and waited. I heard something, she said, about the woman across the street. I kept my expression neutral. Okay. People on this block talk, Daniel, you know that. She folded her hands on the table. Her nail polish was a dark burgundy. Apparently she's been coming around quite a bit. People have noticed. She's a good neighbor. I'm sure she is. Stacy looked at me for a moment. She's also had a thing for you for years. I know that now. Apparently the neighborhood has known it longer than either of us. She was interested in you before we even divorced. I held her gaze and didn't respond. I know you, Stacy said. And there was something almost affectionate in the way she said it, a residue of genuine care, maybe, underneath whatever else she'd come here to do. You're a good person, and you see the good in people, and sometimes that makes you slow. So I'm telling you, she's been running a very deliberate play. The soup, the book, the ladder. You think those were all just spontaneous? She's been building towards you one careful step at a time. She paused and let that land. That's not kindness, Daniel. That's a strategy. And you've been too polite to see it. She left about 20 minutes later. We walked to the door and said goodbye the way divorced people do after enough time has passed, with a worn politeness, like two countries that aren't enemies anymore but aren't quite comfortable yet either. I closed the door and stood in the front hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee from what was left in the pot, and sat down at the table she'd just vacated. The lantern outside came on as the evening darkened. The bulb Nora had brought months ago, the right type, she'd said, and it had been, was doing what it was supposed to do, throwing its small circle of warm light on the porch boards. I sat with my coffee and thought carefully about what Stacy had said. She wasn't lying. That was the thing I kept arriving at, circling and arriving at again. Every single data point she'd cited was accurate. Nora had arrived with a bulb she shouldn't have known the specification for. Nora had monitored the movements of my truck closely enough to notice a 3-day absence. Nora had appeared at the base of a ladder with no invitation. Nora had left a specific book, selected from a single offhand comment in a crowd, with no name on it. All of this was true. The facts were solid, but Stacy had handed me the facts and told me what they meant. And I was sitting here realizing that the meaning was hers, not theirs. She'd read deliberateness into it and called it manipulation. She'd seen a pattern and called it a scheme. And maybe she wasn't entirely wrong about the deliberateness. Maybe Nora had been deliberate. But deliberate isn't the same as calculated. Paying close attention to someone isn't the same as engineering an outcome. Stacy knew the difference, I thought, but had decided to blur it. Still, I needed to think. I gave myself the grace to take that seriously rather than dismissing it. For 3 days I avoided her. I adjusted my schedule, leaving earlier, coming home through the side street, staying in the back of the house in the evenings when her porch light was on. I told myself I was thinking, which was true. I was also afraid of something I couldn't name clearly enough to address head-on, which was also true, and which is less flattering. I let the two of them coexist, and tried to be honest about both. On the third night, I was standing at the living room window when I saw her. Nora was sitting on her own front steps, alone. She had a book in her lap, the hardcover one, the one I'd found on my steps, the one I was still reading slowly, and her hands were on it. But she wasn't looking down at the pages. She was looking across the street, at my house, at the windows. I watched her from behind the glass, and what I saw dismantled the last of the argument Stacy had been making. Because what I saw wasn't someone calculating her next move. What I saw was someone who had handed something over the truest thing she had, and was sitting now in the uncertainty of what happened next, without any play left to make. She wasn't doing anything. She was just there, in the dark, holding a book, looking at a house whose windows were dark, because the man inside was afraid and trying to sort himself out. A person who is running a strategy doesn't sit in the dark like that. A strategy has contingencies. A strategy has next steps. What I was looking at was someone who had reached the end of her lines, who had said the thing and meant it and was now just waiting, with no leverage and no plan, for the world to do what it would do. I stood at the window for a long time, and then I understood something clearly. Whatever Stacy's intentions had been in coming here, whatever truth she'd been wielding, she had handed me exactly the wrong interpretation of it. I went over the next evening. 7 o'clock. I walked across Maple Street for the first time ever in the direction of her porch instead of mine, and I knocked on Nora Castillo's front door. She answered it. She looked at me, and her face did not register surprise, not even the polite, performative version. She just looked, the way you look at something you've been expecting, and stepped back slightly from the doorway, which was an invitation without being one. "You know already," she said before I could begin. "Yeah." Stacy came over. "She did. She told you in a way that was designed to make you cautious." It wasn't a question, more or less. She nodded. There was something quiet and held in her posture, not defensive, not braced, just still, like she'd been sitting with this for 3 days too, and had arrived somewhere on the far side of the anxious part. "So you're here," she said. "What does that mean?" I had come over with something prepared, a logical sequence of statements about where I was and what I needed, and what felt fair to ask of her given my uncertainty. I'd run it through my head on the walk across the street, and then she'd opened the door and it had all gone somewhere else, and what was left was just the unprocessed truth. "I don't know where I am exactly," I said. "I know I'm not ready to make declarations. I know the last few years have left me slower than I used to be about things like this, but I also know that I spent 3 days avoiding you, and every single day felt worse than the one before. Worse than when I found out what Stacy had come to tell me. That seemed like something I needed to pay attention to." She was quiet. She looked at the floor of her entryway for a moment, then back up at me. "I need you to hear me say one thing," she said. "Not because I owe you an explanation, but because I want the record to be right." She held my eyes. I was never running a play. I heard what she said people talk on this street, and I know what it sounded like. The bulb, the soup, the book. I know how it looks when you list them out in sequence, but I didn't sit down and engineer any of it. I just paid attention. When you care about someone, you notice what they need, and every time I noticed something, I had to decide whether to act on it or talk myself out of it. And I kept acting on it because I kept not having the courage to just tell you directly. She let a breath out. "The honest kind. The kind that costs something. I've liked you since the day you moved in," she said. "You pulled up in that truck, got out, and stood in front of the house and just looked at it like you were taking stock of something that mattered. I was inside watching through the window, and I thought, that man looks lonely in a way I recognize. And I thought, I would like very much to know that man." A pause. Her voice was steady. "It took me almost 2 years to work up to a light bulb. If that's a strategy, it's the least efficient one in human history." Something in my chest, something I'd been holding tighter than I'd realized, released itself. Not all at once. Just enough. "I'm not easy to know," I said. "I know that," she said. "I've been noticing it for 2 years." And the corner of her mouth moved just barely, just enough to be real. I almost said it then. 3 words that were fully assembled and ready, that I felt physically in my chest and throat. I held them back not out of fear, not anymore, but out of something closer to care. I wanted those words to be earned, not just the response to a good moment, not just the thing you say when someone makes you feel understood. I wanted to be sure of them in a longer way. "I need to paint the back fence tomorrow," I said. "I've been meaning to do it since April." She looked at me for a long moment, reading the shift, understanding it. "Do you want help?" she said. "I was hoping you'd offer." She smiled, not the careful, measured one I'd been receiving for months, but the full one, the one that moved her whole face, that had clearly been waiting behind all those smaller versions. "What time?" she said. "8." I said. "I'll be there," she said. I walked back across Maple Street in the early evening, and the lantern above my door was lit, and I felt steadier than I had in days. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does in central Ohio, a week of warmth and then a week of cold, and then, finally, sometime in April, it decided to commit. The fence got painted on the second Saturday of the month, a morning that started chilly and turned genuinely warm by 10. I did the lower section. Nora took the middle. She was wearing an old shirt of indeterminate color, something that had once been blue, and she worked efficiently, no wasted motion, with the focused quiet of someone who is comfortable with physical tasks and doesn't feel the need to narrate them. At some point she reached across for the brush and caught a streak of white paint across the top of her head without noticing. It stayed there for most of the morning. I saw it every time I glanced over, which was more often than the project strictly required. She was absorbed in what she was doing. The paint dried in her hair. I didn't say a word. I thought, I want more Saturday mornings like this one. That was all. It was a clear and specific thought, uncomplicated, and I let it be what it was. By June, there was a small wooden table on my front porch. I'd spotted it at an estate sale 2 blocks over Solid Oak. Good proportions, showing its age in the ways that good furniture shows its age, and I'd carried it home in one piece, because the moment I saw it I knew exactly where it went. Nora started coming over in the evenings. Not every evening. She had her own life, her own rhythms, friends and obligations, and the particular way teachers decompress from a school year when it finally ends. But often enough, she'd cross the street with something: pasta, a salad, sandwiches from the Italian place on 5th, and we'd sit at the table while the sun went down over Maple Street. The cicadas started up around 8. The air smelled like the yards in the evening, like warm pavement releasing its heat. We talked, and sometimes we didn't, and both felt equally right. I noticed something during those evenings. I wasn't performing, wasn't managing the space between us or calculating what to say next. I was just there. It's a thing I hadn't felt in a long time, maybe longer than I'd been willing to acknowledge. In the middle of the summer, she had me over for dinner on her side of the street. It was the first time I'd been inside her house. She cooked not elaborately, just well. The kind of cooking that is confident, without trying to impress. Afterward we sat on her back porch until it got too dark, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't, and when I finally walked back across the street, it was nearly 11, and the neighborhood was quiet, and the lantern above my door was lit, and I stood on my porch for a moment before going in, and I thought, this is a good life. And the thought was about more than the evening. In September, we were sitting on my porch steps in the early evening side by side, close enough that I was aware of every small point of contact between us, and the lantern overhead was on, the way it always was now. Nora was looking up at it. The night was still warm, that last warmth that October will take from you but that September offers with both hands. "Does it feel strange to you," she said, "that it was dark for so long, and now it's always on?" I looked at her face, the lantern light on her hair and the side of her cheek. "Someone replaced the bulb," I said. She turned, and her eyes met mine, and the 3 words that had been assembled in my chest for months were right there again. Right there. I held them another moment. Not because I was afraid, because I had decided they deserved a good container, a moment that was fully ready for them, and I wasn't sure yet that this was it. The silence between us was not empty. It had weight and warmth, and everything that needed to be communicated without those words was already being communicated. She turned back to the lantern. I looked at her profile in the light. The night settled around us like a hand laid gently on a shoulder. Then December came. The first snow arrived after midnight on a Thursday. I know because it woke me, that particular quality of silence that descends when the world goes white. a change in the way the air holds itself that you feel before you hear it. I got up and stood at the bedroom window. The street was gone under half an inch of clean, untracked snow. Nora's house across the way had a light on just the one window, warm and steady. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. Typed, "You awake?" Her reply came in under 30 seconds. "Yeah. Beautiful, right?" I looked out. The lantern on my porch was throwing its circle of light down into the snow, and the reflection was making everything in that small radius glow. The whole street was silver and still, and the flakes were coming down steady and soft. I typed, "Come look at it from this side." 10 minutes later, she knocked on the front door. She was wearing her coat over what were clearly pajamas, and she was carrying 2 mugs of cocoa. She had somehow made them in that 10 minutes, or had started making them the moment I texted. I never found out which, and I never asked. We stood on the porch together in the cold, not talking, and watched the snow come down over Maple Street, and it was one of the best hours I can remember. Not because anything happened, because nothing had to. A year went by after that first afternoon on the ladder. I'm not sure where it went into mornings and work days and weekend projects and meals across the street and evenings on the porch, and all the small and unremarkable hours that don't announce themselves as significant while they're accumulating, but that turn out, looking back, to have been everything. The kind of time that is not dramatic and is entirely the point. On a Saturday in July one year, nearly to the day, from when Nora had stood at the base of that ladder and said what she said, I went out to the front porch with the ladder again. The bulb in the lantern had finally burned out. First time in a year, I pulled the ladder from the garage and set it up against the porch, and I started up the first rung, and I heard footsteps crossing the street. When I looked down, Nora was there. She'd crossed without being called, holding the red and black toolbox in both hands. She stopped at the base of the ladder and held it steady without saying a word. I looked down at her. She looked up at me. Samma leather, samma lantern, samma woman. Same expression on her face, patient, unhurried, present in the complete and particular way she'd always been present, from the very beginning, before I'd had the eyes to see it clearly. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying, or there was everything, and it had all been said, accumulated and deposited into the bank of a year's worth of mornings and evenings on Maple Street. I came down the ladder slowly. I stepped onto the porch and stood in front of her. I took the toolbox from her hands and set it down at our feet, and then I said it, for the first time out loud, with the full weight of meaning behind it. Plainly, the way I say everything when I mean it without qualification. I love you, Nora. She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She just looked at me for one quiet moment. And then she nodded once, slowly the way a person nods when they have known something for a long time and are finally hearing the world confirm it, like she'd always known, and like the wait had been entirely worth it. I used to think love had to be loud to count, that if something was real, it declared itself. Stacy was good at declaration. She felt things in volume, expressed things in full sentences, filled a room with the noise of her own certainty. I confused that for depth for years. I think a lot of people make that mistake at least once. Nora never once tried to convince me of anything. She didn't make speeches. She didn't press. She just paid attention to me in the particular way of someone who has decided you are worth the long view. And she acted on that attention, one small, honest gesture at a time, a light bulb, a container of soup, a book, and a hand on a ladder, until the truth of it was undeniable. Not because she'd argued her case, but because she'd simply been there, consistently and without condition, long enough that I couldn't pretend otherwise. She didn't come to save me. She never tried to fix whatever had gone quiet in me after the marriage ended. She just stood nearby literally, sometimes, at the base of a ladder while I worked things out on my own timeline. And she trusted that timeline. And she was still there when I came down. The lantern above my front door is lit right now as I tell you this. It will be lit tomorrow. I don't let it go dark anymore. That's not an accident. It's a decision I make because some things, once you've let them go dim for long enough, you understand the value of keeping them burning. The person who loves you most is not always the loudest one in the room. Sometimes they're the ones still standing there, steady and quiet and real, when you finally turn all the way around to look. Have you ever realized someone loved you only after you'd nearly walked away from the chance to know it? And if that happened to you, did you go back? If this story landed somewhere true for you, leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long. One word is enough. Hit like if you believe that the quiet, patient kind of love is as real as any other kind, more real, maybe, for being hard to fake. And subscribe to this channel. We're here every week with stories like this one. Stories about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just stays,